She thought it was just a forgotten necklace buried in a dusty box, but the moment she opened it, everything changed. Who was MR? Why had this treasure from 1864 been hidden away, and what secrets did it carry through the decades? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from and why you're following this. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Beacon Street as Miss Eleanor Whitmore stepped carefully over the rain-slicked cobblestones, her burgundy traveling dress trailing just above the wet pavement. Boston, in late October of 1895, wore its autumn colors proudly, the maple trees lining the street aflame with crimson and gold leaves that danced in the crisp breeze sweeping in from the harbor. Eleanor pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the cooling air, as she made her way toward the antiquarian bookshop she had passed countless times but never entered. She was 24 years old, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, though her mother reminded her weekly that such independence was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain in proper Boston society. Eleanor taught literature at Miss Pemberton's Academy for Young Ladies, a position that afforded her modest independence and the respect of being called an educator, rather than simply waiting to become someone's wife. Her students adored her animated readings of poetry and her passionate discussions of the great novels, though the headmistress often cautioned her against being too progressive in her interpretations. The bookshop door chimed softly as Eleanor entered, and the scent of old leather and aged paper enveloped her like a familiar embrace. The proprietor, an elderly gentleman with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, nodded from behind his cluttered counter before returning to his cataloging. Eleanor wandered through the narrow aisles, her fingers trailing along the spines of forgotten volumes, when something caught her eye in the dim corner near the back of the shop. A small wooden box sat on a lower shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of atlases from the previous century. Something about it drew her attention, perhaps the way the afternoon light filtering through the dusty window seemed to illuminate it specifically, or perhaps simply curiosity. Eleanor knelt down, her skirts pooling around her, and carefully lifted the box. It was surprisingly light, crafted from walnut wood with intricate carved designs along its edges, patterns that suggested it had once belonged to someone of considerable means. The clasp opened easily, as if it had been waiting for her touch, and inside, nestled on faded velvet that had once been deep purple but had faded to pale lavender, lay a necklace that took her breath away. The piece was extraordinary, a delicate gold chain holding a pendant of remarkable craftsmanship. The centerpiece was a cameo carved from what appeared to be ivory or perhaps bone, depicting a woman's profile surrounded by tiny pearls and what might have been small diamonds, though Eleanor could not be certain. But what captured her attention most was the inscription on the back of the pendant, revealed when she turned it over with trembling fingers. To MR, with eternal devotion, 1864. The year struck her immediately. 1864. The height of the Civil War, when the nation had been torn apart, when countless families had been separated, when love letters had crossed battle lines and hearts had broken with every casualty report. Eleanor felt an inexplicable connection to this forgotten treasure, as if the necklace itself was calling out across 3 decades, asking to have its story told. "Excuse me?" Eleanor called out, rising carefully and making her way back to the front counter. "This box in the back corner, the walnut one with the necklace inside. Where did it come from?" The proprietor looked up, his watery blue eyes squinting as he considered her question. He set down his pen and shuffled around the counter, following Eleanor back to where she had found the box. When he saw it in her hands, recognition flickered across his weathered features. "Ah, yes. That came to me about a week ago, part of an estate sale from a house on Louisburg Square. The family was clearing out after the matriarch passed. Elderly woman, 92 years old if I recall correctly. Most of what they brought me was worthless, damaged books and outdated almanacs, but I took the lot because they seemed desperate to be rid of it all. I had not yet gone through everything thoroughly. You say there is a necklace inside?" Eleanor opened the box again, showing him the delicate piece. The shopkeeper leaned in, pulling a jeweler's loop from his vest pocket to examine it more closely. After a moment he straightened, his expression thoughtful. "This is quality work, certainly from the 1860s based on the style. The stones appear genuine, though I am no expert in such matters. The craftsmanship is exceptional. It would have been quite valuable when it was made, and likely still is. I wonder why it was simply packed away in a box and forgotten." He paused, studying Eleanor's face. "You are interested in purchasing it, miss?" Eleanor hesitated. Her salary was modest, and she had been saving carefully for a trip to New York to visit the museums and theaters there next spring. But something about this necklace would not release its hold on her imagination. The inscription, the date, the mystery of who M.R. had been and why such a beautiful gift had been abandoned in a forgotten box in an estate sale. "How much would you ask for it?" she inquired carefully. The proprietor considered, turning the box over in his hands. "Given that I paid very little for the entire lot, and considering you are a regular customer who has purchased many books from me over the years, I would say $15 would be fair." It was more than Eleanor had intended to spend, but not impossibly so. She calculated quickly in her mind. If she were careful with her expenses over the next few months, if she brought her lunch to the academy rather than occasionally purchasing it from the nearby cafe, if she walked rather than taking the horse-drawn omnibus on pleasant days, she could manage it without dipping too deeply into her travel savings. "I will take it," she said, surprising herself with the quickness of her decision. As the proprietor wrapped the box carefully in brown paper and string, Eleanor found herself already composing questions in her mind. Who had been M.R.? Who had loved her enough to commission such an exquisite piece during one of the darkest periods in American history? Why had it been separated from its owner, tucked away and forgotten? And most intriguingly, what had become of the people connected to this beautiful, abandoned treasure? Eleanor left the bookshop as the afternoon shadows lengthened further, the package tucked securely under her arm. She should have headed directly home to the modest boarding house where she rented 2 comfortable rooms, but instead, she found her feet carrying her toward the Boston Public Library. If there was a story here, and she was increasingly convinced there was, perhaps she could find some trace of it in the city's records. The library was warm and welcoming after the chill of the street, gas lamps already lit against the gathering dusk. Eleanor approached the reference desk, where a stern-looking librarian with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun regarded her with the expression of someone whose patience was perpetually tested. "I am looking for records from 1864, Eleanor began. "Specifically, I am trying to trace the history of a piece of jewelry with the initials M.R. inscribed on it. I know it is not much to go on, but I was hoping perhaps there might be society pages from that year, or marriage announcements, something that might help me identify the owner." The librarian's expression softened slightly, perhaps recognizing a fellow seeker of knowledge. "The society pages from that era are kept in the archive room on the 3rd floor. However, you should know that 1864 was a difficult year for record-keeping. The war consumed everyone's attention, and many of the usual social announcements were either not published or were quite abbreviated. Additionally, the archive room closes in 30 minutes. You are welcome to begin your search, but you will need to return tomorrow to continue if you do not find what you seek today." Eleanor thanked her and hurried up the marble stairs to the 3rd floor, her footsteps echoing in the quiet building. The archive room was smaller than she had expected, lined with shelves holding bound volumes of old newspapers and city records. She located the section for 1864 and carefully pulled down several heavy volumes, carrying them to a nearby reading table. The pages were brittle with age, yellowed and fragile, and Eleanor turned them with the utmost care. The society pages, when she found them, were indeed sparse compared to what she was accustomed to seeing in modern newspapers. Instead of lengthy descriptions of parties and balls, there were brief mentions of small gatherings, almost always connected to fundraising efforts for the war. There were memorial services announced for fallen soldiers, notices of women organizing aid societies to send supplies to the troops, advertisements for businesses still managing to operate despite the chaos consuming the nation. Eleanor searched through January, February, March, running her finger down column after column, looking for any mention of initials M.R. or descriptions of jewelry or anything that might connect to the necklace now in her possession. The task was tedious and straining on her eyes in the dimming light, and she was beginning to lose hope when a small notice in the April 15th edition caught her attention. The family of Miss Margaret Rose Sutherland regrets to announce the cancellation of her engagement to Captain Jonathan Aldrich of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, owing to circumstances beyond their control. The family requests privacy during this difficult time. Margaret Rose. M.R. Eleanor's heart quickened. The timing was right, the initials matched, and the mention of a canceled engagement during wartime suggested a story worth investigating. She quickly scanned the surrounding pages for any additional information, but found nothing more about Margaret Rose Sutherland or Captain Aldrich. 5 minutes until closing, a voice called from the doorway. Eleanor carefully noted the date and details of the announcement in the small journal she always carried, then returned the volumes to their proper places. As she descended the library stairs and emerged into the cool evening air, her mind was already racing ahead. She had a name now, and the beginning of a story. But she needed more information, and she suspected that uncovering the full truth about this necklace and its owner would require assistance from someone with access to records and resources beyond what she could obtain on her own. The following morning, Eleanor stood before her students at Miss Pemberton's academy, leading them through a discussion of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese. But her mind kept drifting to the necklace hidden in her room and the mystery surrounding Margaret Rose Sutherland. During her lunch hour, rather than eating in the teacher's common room as usual, she slipped away to the headmistress's office to use the academy's telephone, one of the few such devices in the neighborhood and a source of great pride for the institution. Eleanor had decided overnight that if she was going to investigate this mystery properly, she needed help from someone with authority and access to official records. That meant the police, though the thought of walking into a police station unaccompanied made her somewhat nervous. It would be far more proper to make an initial inquiry by telephone to gauge whether her questions would be taken seriously or dismissed as the fanciful concerns of an overly imaginative woman. The operator connected her to the Boston Police Department's main office, and after several transfers and explanations, she found herself speaking with a detective lieutenant named Thomas Ashford, who apparently handled matters related to historical inquiries and cold cases, though Eleanor had not been aware such a specialty existed. Detective Ashford speaking. I understand you have questions about an old case. His voice was deep and measured, with an accent that suggested education and refinement rather than the rough manner she had expected from a policeman. Eleanor explained about finding the necklace, about the inscription, about the newspaper notice she had discovered. She tried to keep her voice professional and matter-of-fact, not wanting to sound like she was chasing shadows or wasting official time. When she finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. Miss Whitmore, you said your name was, and you are calling from Miss Pemberton's academy? Another pause. The Sutherland case is one I am familiar with, actually. It has always been something of an unsolved mystery in departmental records. If you truly have found a necklace belonging to Margaret Rose Sutherland, that could be significant. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss this further and allow me to examine the piece? I could come to a location of your choosing, wherever you would feel comfortable and proper. Eleanor felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. She had expected polite dismissal or perhaps condescending amusement, not immediate interest and validation. I would be willing to meet with you, Detective. Perhaps tomorrow afternoon. There is a respectable cafe on Newbury Street, Madame Bouchard's. That would be appropriate. Would 3 o'clock suit you? 3 o'clock at Madame Bouchard's on Newbury Street. I will be there, Miss Whitmore. And please, bring the necklace if you are comfortable doing so. I look forward to meeting you and discussing what you have discovered. After disconnecting the call, Eleanor stood for a moment in the headmistress's office, her hand still resting on the telephone's wooden box. She had taken the first step into what she sensed would be a journey into the past, and somehow she knew that meeting Detective Thomas Ashford tomorrow would change everything. Eleanor arrived at Madame Bouchard's cafe 15 minutes early, a habit ingrained by years of punctuality at the academy. The establishment was elegant without being ostentatious, its lace curtains filtering the autumn afternoon light into soft patterns across the polished wooden tables. She chose a corner table that offered both privacy and respectability, visible enough to avoid any appearance of impropriety but secluded enough for confidential conversation. The necklace rested in its wooden box inside her handbag, and she found herself touching the bag repeatedly, as if to reassure herself of its presence. She ordered tea and waited, watching the other patrons with feigned interest, while her mind raced with questions and possibilities. What would this detective be like? Would he take her seriously, or would this meeting prove to be a waste of time for both of them? She had worn her most professional day dress, a deep forest green wool with modest black trim, and had arranged her chestnut hair in a practical but becoming style that suggested competence rather than vanity. At precisely 3 o'clock, the cafe door opened, and Eleanor knew immediately which of the entering patrons was Detective Thomas Ashford. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet or slightly more, with broad shoulders that filled his well-tailored charcoal suit coat admirably. His hair was dark brown, almost black, with distinguished touches of silver at the temples, despite his appearing to be no more than 32 or 33 years old. His face was strong-featured and thoughtful, with intelligent gray eyes that scanned the cafe until they settled on her with unmistakable recognition. He approached her table with confident but unhurried steps, removing his hat as he drew near. "Miss Whitmore, I am Detective Lieutenant Thomas Ashford. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." His voice matched what she remembered from the telephone, cultured and assured, and when he smiled, his entire countenance transformed from merely handsome to genuinely striking. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise to her cheeks, which she firmly attributed to the heat from her teacup rather than any reaction to the detective's appearance. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Please, sit down, Detective Ashford. Would you care for tea or coffee?" "Coffee would be excellent, thank you." He settled into the chair with easy grace, and Eleanor signaled the waitress, who hurried over with obvious appreciation for the distinguished gentleman now gracing their establishment. Once his coffee had been ordered and they were alone again, Thomas leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind. "I must confess, Miss Whitmore, when I received your call yesterday, I was intrigued. The Sutherland case has haunted me since I first encountered it in the archives 5 years ago, when I was newly promoted to detective. May I see the necklace?" Eleanor carefully extracted the wooden box from her handbag and placed it on the table between them. Thomas opened it with reverent care, and she watched his face as he examined the piece. His fingers were long and capable, handling the delicate necklace with unexpected gentleness. He turned it over to read the inscription, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or vindication. "This is authentic," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "The craftsmanship matches descriptions from the original reports. Miss Whitmore, do you have any idea what you have found?" He looked up at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch slightly. This necklace was thought to be lost forever, possibly destroyed. It was the center of a scandal that rocked Boston society in 1864, and the key to understanding what really happened to Margaret Rose Sutherland. The waitress returned with Thomas's coffee, and they both waited in charged silence until she departed. Eleanor leaned forward, her own excitement now matching his. "Please, tell me everything you know. I found a brief mention of a canceled engagement in the newspaper archives, but nothing more. Who was Margaret Rose Sutherland, and what happened to her?" Thomas took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts, and Eleanor found herself noticing details about him that she normally would not have permitted herself to observe. The way his hands wrapped around the cup, the slight furrow between his brows as he organized the information, the way the afternoon light caught the silver in his hair. She forced her attention back to his words as he began to speak. "Margaret Rose Sutherland was the daughter of Edmund Sutherland, a wealthy shipping merchant here in Boston. In early 1864, she was 21 years old, considered one of the most beautiful and accomplished young women in society, known for her charitable work and her musical talents. She was engaged to Captain Jonathan Aldrich, a rising officer in the 54th Massachusetts Infantry, one of the first official African-American units in the Union Army, though Aldrich himself was white, from an old Boston abolitionist family. Eleanor listened intently, the pieces beginning to form a picture in her mind. The 54th Massachusetts. That was the regiment that fought at Fort Wagner, was it not? I remember reading about their bravery. Indeed, Robert Gould Shaw commanded them, and they distinguished themselves despite the prejudices they faced. But I am getting ahead of the story. Thomas set down his coffee cup and continued. Captain Aldrich had commissioned this necklace to be made for Margaret as an engagement gift. The MR stands for Margaret Rose, of course. It was crafted by one of Boston's finest jewelers and was meant to be presented to her at their engagement party in April of 1864. But the party never happened. The newspaper said the engagement was canceled due to circumstances beyond their control. Eleanor interjected. What circumstances? Thomas's expression darkened. That is where the mystery deepens. 3 days before the scheduled engagement party, Margaret Rose Sutherland disappeared. She left her family's home on Lewisburg Square one morning, telling the servants she was going to visit a friend, and she simply never returned. Her family was frantic. The police searched everywhere. There were theories that she had been kidnapped, that she had run away, that she had met with foul play. Her father offered a substantial reward for information leading to her return. Eleanor felt a chill despite the warmth of the cafe. And Captain Aldrich? What happened to him? That is perhaps the most tragic part. Aldrich was devastated. He was granted emergency leave from his regiment to help search for Margaret, but after 2 weeks with no trace of her, he had to return to his unit. He was killed a month later at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm in Virginia. He died never knowing what became of his fiancée. Thomas paused, his voice heavy with the weight of the old tragedy. The necklace was never presented to Margaret because she vanished before the party could take place. It should have been among Aldrich's effects when they were returned to his family, but there was no record of it. Everyone assumed it had been lost or stolen during the war. But if Margaret disappeared before receiving it, how did it end up in that estate sale from Louisburg Square? Eleanor asked, her mind working through the implications. You said the Sutherland family lived on Louisburg Square. Could this have come from their house? Thomas's eyes lit with appreciation for her quick thinking. That is precisely the question I asked myself when you told me where you found it. Miss Whitmore, would you be willing to help me investigate this further? I realize it is highly unusual to ask a civilian to assist in a police inquiry, but this case has always been unofficial for me, something I have pursued in my spare time because it troubled me, and you have already demonstrated remarkable intuition in recognizing the significance of what you found. Eleanor should have been cautious. Proper young ladies did not involve themselves in police investigations, even historical ones. Her mother would be scandalized, and the headmistress of the academy would certainly disapprove if she learned of it. But as she looked at Thomas Ashford, at the earnest intelligence in his eyes and the respectful way he regarded her as an equal, rather than a delicate creature to be protected from unpleasant realities, she felt something shift inside her. I would be honored to help, Detective Ashford. This mystery has captured my imagination, and I feel a strange responsibility toward Margaret Rose, as if finding her necklace has created an obligation to discover her truth. Eleanor surprised herself with her own boldness, but she meant every word. Please, if we are to work together on this, you should call me Thomas, and may I have permission to address you as Eleanor? I find that formality can sometimes impede the free exchange of ideas, and I suspect we will need to communicate quite openly if we are to solve this puzzle. Thomas, then, and yes, please call me Eleanor. She felt a flutter in her stomach as she spoke his name, a sensation she had not experienced in years, not since a brief and unsuccessful courtship when she was 20. She pushed the feeling aside, or tried to, and focused on the practical matters at hand. Where do we begin? Thomas reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small notebook and pencil. I propose we start by visiting the house on Louisburg Square where the estate sale took place. If the necklace was there, there may be other items or documents that could shed light on what happened. I took the liberty of obtaining the address from the bookshop proprietor this morning. The house belonged to a Mrs. Adelaide Sutherland, who passed away at age 92. I believe she may have been Edmund Sutherland's widow, Margaret's mother, though I will need to verify that through records. If she was Margaret's mother, and she kept the necklace all these years, that suggests she knew something about what happened to her daughter, Eleanor reasoned. Perhaps she could not bear to part with it, or perhaps she was waiting for Margaret to return. Or perhaps, Thomas added quietly, she knew Margaret would never return, and kept the necklace as a memorial. He met Eleanor's eyes. Are you free tomorrow afternoon? I could arrange for us to visit the house. It has not yet been fully cleared out according to my inquiries. The family is still sorting through decades of accumulated possessions. Eleanor mentally reviewed her schedule at the academy. I finish my classes at 2 o'clock. I could meet you there at 2:30, if that would suit. Perfect. I will make the arrangements and send a message to your boarding house with the exact time and location. Thomas closed his notebook and regarded her with an expression that seemed to combine professional respect with something warmer, something personal. Eleanor, I want you to know that I appreciate your willingness to pursue this. Many people would have simply kept the necklace or sold it without a second thought. The fact that you cared enough to investigate its history speaks well of your character. Eleanor felt that warmth in her cheeks again. I am a teacher of literature, Thomas. I have spent my life believing that every story matters, that every forgotten voice deserves to be heard. Margaret Rose Sutherland's story has been silent for 31 years. If we can give her a voice again, even now, then perhaps some justice can finally be served. They spoke for another half hour, sharing their thoughts and theories about what might have happened in 1864, comparing notes about what they each knew of the period and the social dynamics that might have influenced events. Eleanor found herself impressed by Thomas's knowledge of history and social context, and he seemed equally appreciative of her insights into the motivations and pressures that would have shaped a young woman's choices in that era. When they finally parted on Newbury Street, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the autumn sky in shades of amber and rose. Thomas held her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary as they said goodbye, and Eleanor felt the warmth of his touch through her glove. "Until tomorrow, Eleanor. I have a feeling we are on the verge of uncovering something significant. Until tomorrow, Thomas." She watched him walk away, his tall figure moving with purpose through the early evening crowd, and realized that her interest in this mystery had become entangled with an interest in the detective himself, a complication she had not anticipated but found herself unable to resist. That evening, back in her rooms at the boarding house, Eleanor sat at her small writing desk with the necklace laid out before her. The gas lamp cast a golden glow over the delicate gold chain and the ivory cameo, and she imagined Margaret Rose Sutherland as she might have been, a young woman in love, waiting for a necklace she would never receive, disappearing into history without explanation. What had happened to her? Had she run away, been kidnapped, met with tragedy? And how had this precious gift ended up back in what was presumably her mother's house decades later? Eleanor picked up her pen and began to write in her journal, documenting everything she had learned, every question that remained unanswered, every theory that seemed plausible. As she wrote, she found herself also noting her impressions of Thomas Ashford, the way he listened with genuine interest, the intelligence that shone in his eyes, the respectful manner in which he treated her as a partner rather than a subordinate or a curiosity. She was falling into dangerous territory, she knew. Thomas was a detective, a man of the world, sophisticated and educated and undoubtedly accustomed to far more glamorous company than a literature teacher from a modest background. He was being kind to her because she had information relevant to his investigation, nothing more. She needed to maintain her perspective, to focus on the mystery at hand rather than weaving romantic fantasies around a professional relationship. But even as she lectured herself on practicality and proper boundaries, Eleanor could not quite suppress the hope that had taken root in her heart, the hope that perhaps Thomas's interest in her extended beyond the necklace and its story, the hope that the connection she felt growing between them might be mutual. Tomorrow they would visit the Sutherland house together, and she would learn more about both Margaret Rose's fate and Thomas Ashford's character. Whatever they discovered, Eleanor sensed that her life had taken an unexpected turn, and there would be no going back to the simple routine she had known before finding that abandoned necklace in a forgotten box. The Sutherland house on Louisburg Square stood like a monument to faded grandeur, its red brick facade weathered by decades of New England winters, but still maintaining the dignified bearing of old money and established social position. Eleanor approached from the corner of Mount Vernon Street at precisely 2:30, her heart beating faster than the brisk walk warranted. Thomas was already there, waiting on the sidewalk before the wrought iron gate, and when he saw her, his face brightened in a way that made her feel as if she were the only person in the world at that moment. "Eleanor, punctual as always," he greeted her, offering his arm. "The family representative is expecting us." I explained that we were investigating the provenance of an item from the estate sale and wished to examine any remaining papers or effects that might provide historical context. She took his arm, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his coat, and they walked together up the stone steps to the front door. A middle-aged woman answered their knock, introducing herself as Mrs. Dorothy Hadley, a distant cousin of the deceased Mrs. Adelaide Sutherland, tasked with overseeing the final disposition of the estate. "Such a sad business," Mrs. Hadley said as she led them through an entrance hall that still held the ghostly elegance of its former glory, though dust covers shrouded most of the furniture, and the air held the musty scent of a house long closed to fresh breezes. Aunt Adelaide was the last of her generation, you understand. She outlived her husband by 40 years. Her son died childless 20 years ago, and there are really no close relatives left. Just us distant cousins dividing up what remains. Thomas and Eleanor exchanged meaningful glances. If Adelaide's son had died childless, that meant any knowledge of Margaret Rose's fate had likely died with Adelaide herself, unless she had left some record behind. "Mrs. Hadley?" Eleanor ventured carefully. Did Mrs. Sutherland ever speak of having a daughter? A daughter named Margaret Rose who lived here in the 1860s. Mrs. Hadley paused in the hallway, her hand resting on a covered side table. Her expression became troubled, shadowed by old family secrets. Margaret Rose. Yes, I heard that name mentioned once or twice when I was a girl. Always in whispers. Always with a sort of sadness that made it clear we were not to ask questions. My mother told me once that Aunt Adelaide had lost a daughter in her youth, under tragic and mysterious circumstances, but the family never spoke of it openly. It was as if Margaret Rose had been erased from the family history, too painful to acknowledge. Did your aunt leave any papers, any journals or correspondence from that period? Thomas asked, his detective's instincts clearly engaged. Anything that might shed light on what happened? Mrs. Hadley considered this. There are trunks in the attic, boxes of old letters and documents that none of us have had the time or inclination to sort through properly. The house is to be sold next month, and whatever is not claimed or catalogued by then will likely be discarded or donated to historical societies. You are welcome to examine anything you find relevant. Honestly, I would be grateful if you could make sense of it. The past should not simply be thrown away without understanding. She led them up 3 flights of increasingly narrow stairs to an attic that stretched the length of the house. Afternoon light slanted through dormer windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The space was crowded with the accumulated debris of a long life and an even longer family history. Furniture from multiple generations, paintings whose subjects stared down with stern Victorian disapproval, trunks and boxes stacked in precarious towers. I will leave you to your work, Mrs. Hadley said. Please take whatever time you need. I will be downstairs if you require anything. When they were alone, Eleanor and Thomas stood for a moment, taking in the overwhelming scope of the task before them. Then Thomas removed his jacket, rolling up his shirt sleeves with practical efficiency that Eleanor found oddly endearing, and together they began to systematically search through the attic's contents. They worked side by side for over an hour, opening trunks filled with old clothing, boxes of business ledgers from Edmund Sutherland's shipping company, photograph albums showing unsmiling faces from decades past. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of Thomas's presence beside her, the way he moved with careful deliberation, the thoughtful furrow of his brow as he examined documents, the gentle way he handled fragile papers and photographs as if honoring the lives they represented. "Eleanor, come look at this," Thomas called from near one of the dormer windows. He had opened a small leather trunk, and inside were bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, along with what appeared to be several journals bound in worn cloth covers. Eleanor hurried over, kneeling beside him as he carefully extracted one of the journals. The name on the inside cover, written in elegant feminine script, made them both catch their breath. Adelaide Margaret Sutherland, 1863. "This is her journal from the year before Margaret Rose disappeared," Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to believe their good fortune. "Thomas, this could contain everything we need to know." Thomas opened the journal carefully, turning to entries from early 1864. Adelaide's handwriting was clear and precise, her observations about daily life detailed and thoughtful. They read together, their heads bent close over the brittle pages, and gradually the story of Margaret Rose began to emerge from the past. January 15th, 1864. Margaret has been seeing Captain Aldrich more frequently these past weeks. He is a fine young man from an excellent family, though I confess his involvement with the 54th Regiment troubles Edmund greatly. Not for any lack of courage or honor, but for the social complications it presents. How does one celebrate an engagement when the groom-to-be commands colored troops? The Aldrich family's abolitionist fervor is admirable, but it makes for difficult dinner conversation among Edmund's business associates. February 3rd, 1864. Captain Aldrich formally requested Margaret's hand this evening. Edmund gave his consent, though with reservations he expressed to me privately afterward. I see how Margaret's eyes light when she speaks of her captain. This is what I wished for her, to know genuine love rather than merely a suitable match. Yet I cannot shake a mother's worry that their path will not be easy. March 10th, 1864. Margaret confided something troubling to me today. She has been receiving threatening letters, unsigned notes warning her that her association with Aldrich and his regiment brings shame to proper Boston society. She showed me 3 such letters, filled with vile sentiments about race mixing and betrayal of her class. I wanted to tell Edmund, but Margaret begged me not to, fearing he would call off the engagement to protect her from further harassment. I am torn between honoring my daughter's confidence and ensuring her safety. Eleanor looked up at Thomas, her eyes wide with the implications. Someone was threatening her because of her engagement to Captain Aldrich, because of his command of the 54th Regiment. Thomas nodded grimly. The 54th Massachusetts was controversial in certain circles, despite the valor they demonstrated. There were those who believed that arming African-American soldiers was dangerous, who resented the challenge to established social hierarchies. If Margaret was being threatened because of her association with Aldrich and his cause, that could certainly provide motive for her disappearance. They continued reading, the journal entries growing more troubled as April approached. April 2nd, 1864. The threats have escalated. Today, Margaret received a note stating that if the engagement proceeds, she will face consequences most severe. I can no longer keep this secret from Edmund. Tonight I will tell him everything, and we must take measures to protect our daughter. Captain Aldrich arrives on leave tomorrow, and we will all discuss how to proceed. The engagement party is scheduled for April 10th, but I begin to think we should postpone until these threats can be properly investigated. April 5th, 1864. God help us, Margaret is gone. She left the house this morning saying she was going to visit Elizabeth Morton, but when I sent a servant to fetch her home for dinner, Elizabeth said Margaret had never arrived. We have searched everywhere, questioned everyone. Edmund is beside himself. Captain Aldrich is organizing search parties with his fellow officers. The police have been notified, but they seem more interested in suggesting she ran away than in pursuing the possibility that she has been taken. The last threat she received, which she had hidden in her room and I found only after she vanished, said, "Wednesday morning. Choose wisely, or the choice will be made for you." Wednesday was today. And the journal entry ended there, the rest of the page blank, as if Adelaide had been too distraught to continue. Eleanor felt tears prickling her eyes as she imagined a mother's anguish, the desperate hope that must have consumed Adelaide in the days and weeks that followed. Thomas gently turned to the next entry, dated 2 weeks later, April 19th, 1864. Still no word. Captain Aldrich returns to his regiment tomorrow. The engagement is cancelled, though that seems a cruel formality when we do not know if Margaret lives or dies. Edmund has offered a reward of $5,000 for information leading to her return. The police suggest she ran away to avoid the controversy of her engagement. But a mother knows her daughter. Margaret would never have left willingly, never caused us such pain by choice. Someone took her, someone who believed strongly enough in their hatred to act on their threats. And I fear we will never see our darling girl again. The subsequent entries were sporadic and increasingly despairing. Adelaide wrote of false leads and disappointed hopes, of Edmund's declining health, of the empty chair at their dinner table. In June, she recorded the news of Captain Aldrich's death at Chaffin's farm, noting that she had wept for the young man who would have been her son-in-law, for the love he and Margaret had shared so briefly. Then, in an entry dated September 12, 1864, the journal revealed a truth that neither Eleanor nor Thomas had anticipated. I received a letter today, the handwriting disguised, but the words unmistakable. It was from Margaret. She lives. She is safe, but she can never return. She wrote that the threats were real, that men connected to one of Edmund's business rivals, men who despised Aldrich's command of colored troops, had planned to harm her and disgrace the family. On the morning of April 5th, she received warning from an unexpected source, someone who had learned of the plot but could not reveal themselves. This person helped Margaret escape before the conspirators could act. She is living under an assumed name in a place she could not disclose, protected by people who believe in the causes she and Jonathan supported. She begged me to stop searching, to let the world believe she had died or disappeared forever, because to reveal the truth would put her in danger again and could implicate those who had helped her. She said that Jonathan's necklace, the one he had commissioned for their engagement, was enclosed in a separate package to be sent to me, so I would know the letter was truly from her, so I would have something to remember their love. She asked me to forgive her, to understand that she made the only choice that would preserve her life and honor Jonathan's memory by continuing his work in her own way. The necklace arrived 3 days later. I have hidden it away, unable to bear looking at it, unable to part with it. My daughter lives, somewhere in this vast country, and I cannot even write to her. This is to be my secret, carried alone, because Edmund's heart could not bear knowing Margaret chose exile over family. Eleanor sat back on her heels, overwhelmed by the revelation. She ran away, not because she was taken, but because she was warned and chose to escape. She gave up everything, her family, her name, her love, to survive and to protect those who helped her. Thomas was studying the journal entry intently, his detective's mind clearly working through the implications. The question is, who warned her? Who knew about the plot and helped her escape? And more importantly, where did she go? Did Adelaide ever hear from her again? They continued through the journal. Adelaide recorded no further letters from Margaret, but in entries over the following years there were occasional cryptic references that suggested she might have received some indirect word of her daughter's welfare. References to feeling unexpectedly peaceful, to dreams that brought comfort, to a certainty that Margaret was alive and doing meaningful work. In 1870, Adelaide wrote, "Edmund died today, never knowing the truth. Perhaps that was a mercy. He went to his grave believing our daughter lost to tragedy. I alone carry the knowledge that she lives somewhere, perhaps doing the very work that Jonathan Aldrich died for, carrying forward the causes they both believed in. I pray she has found some happiness in her exile, some purpose that makes the sacrifice worthwhile." The final entry about Margaret was dated 1880, 16 years after her disappearance. "I am an old woman now, and I find myself thinking often of Margaret, wondering if she is aging as I am, wondering if she ever found love again, or if she mourned Jonathan all these years as I have mourned her. I have kept her secret faithfully. When I die, someone will find this journal, find the necklace I have hidden away, and perhaps they will understand that love sometimes requires impossible sacrifices, that survival sometimes demands we abandon everything we hold dear. Margaret Rose, wherever you are, know that your mother understood, forgave, and loved you until her last breath." Eleanor realized she was crying quietly, tears streaming down her face as she absorbed the full weight of Adelaide's devotion and Margaret Rose's courage. Thomas, seeing her distress, gently took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture of comfort that seemed as natural as breathing. "She gave up everything," Eleanor whispered. "Her family, her home, the man she loved, her entire identity. And she did it to stay alive, to escape men who would have harmed her for the crime of loving someone who commanded colored troops, who stood for equality and justice." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion, and her mother carried that secret for 50 years, protecting her even in death by not revealing where she had gone or who had helped her. The depth of their sacrifice, both of them, is staggering. They sat together in the dusty attic for a long moment, hands still clasped, processing what they had learned. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Eleanor, I want to find out what happened to her, where she went, what life she made for herself. She deserves to have her story known, to be remembered as someone who chose principle over comfort, who survived despite those who wished her harm." Eleanor nodded, squeezing his hand. "How do we find her? The trail is 31 years old." "She could have gone anywhere, become anyone." Thomas stood, pulling Eleanor gently to her feet. They stood close together in the slanting afternoon light, and for a moment, the past and present seemed to collapse into a single point of understanding. "We start with the Underground Railroad networks that were still operating during and after the war. We look at abolitionist communities, at places where someone with Margaret's background and beliefs might have found refuge and purpose. We follow the causes she and Aldrich believed in, because that is where she would have gone. And we have one advantage Adelaide never had. We live in an age where communication and record-keeping have improved dramatically. If Margaret Rose Sutherland made a life somewhere, left any trace of her existence, we will find it." Eleanor felt a surge of determination, mixed with something warmer and more personal. Standing here with Thomas, united in their quest to honor Margaret Rose's memory, she felt a connection deeper than professional collaboration. They were partners in this search, but she was beginning to hope they might become partners in something more. "Where do we start?" she asked, though she found herself caring less about the investigation than about the fact that it meant continuing to spend time with this remarkable man who had entered her life so unexpectedly. Thomas smiled, that transforming smile that made her heart skip. "I have contacts in the Historical Society, people who specialize in the abolitionist movements and the networks that help people disappear when necessary. We will reach out to them tomorrow." But right now, we should collect these journals and letters, with Mrs. Hadley's permission, so we can study them more thoroughly. There may be other clues we have missed. They gathered the journals and several bundles of letters, carefully packing them into a box Mrs. Hadley provided when they explained the significance of what they had found. The woman was moved by the story, agreeing immediately that these documents should be preserved and that Margaret Rose's tale deserved to be uncovered and honored. As they left the Sutherland house, the sun was setting over Beacon Hill, painting the brick facades in shades of amber and rose. Thomas carried the box of documents and Eleanor walked beside him, their shoulders occasionally brushing in a way that seemed accidental but felt increasingly intentional. "Eleanor," Thomas said as they reached the corner where their paths would diverge, "I want to thank you for your help with this. Your insight, your compassion for these people from the past, it has made all the difference. I have worked on many cases over the years, but I have never had a partner who understood so intuitively what drives me to seek truth and justice, even for those long dead." Eleanor looked up at him, at the earnest intelligence in his gray eyes, at the way the evening light caught the silver in his hair. "Thomas, I think I have been waiting all my life for a mystery like this, for a story that matters, for someone who values the same things I do." She paused, gathering courage. "And I think I have been waiting for someone like you, though I did not know it until we met." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and for a moment, Eleanor feared she had spoken too boldly, revealed too much too soon. But then Thomas set down the box and took both her hands in his, looking at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "Eleanor Whitmore, I have spent 5 years thinking about Margaret Rose Sutherland and her lost love, mourning the tragic end of their story. But standing here with you, I find myself believing that perhaps some stories can have different endings, that perhaps some loves are not lost, but simply waiting for the right moment to be found." He raised one of her hands to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I would very much like to continue this investigation with you, and I would very much like to explore what is growing between us, if you are willing." Eleanor felt joy flood through her, pure and uncomplicated. "I am willing, Thomas. More than willing." They stood together as darkness fell over Boston, two people united by a mystery from the past, but looking forward to a future they might build together. And Eleanor knew that finding that abandoned necklace had changed her life in ways she could never have imagined, bringing her not just a story worth telling, but a love worth cherishing. The following week passed in a whirlwind of research and revelation, punctuated by meetings that grew increasingly personal as Eleanor and Thomas's professional partnership blossomed into something neither could deny. They spent their evenings at the Historical Society, poring over records of abolitionist networks and underground railroad routes. They visited libraries and archives, searching through church records and aid society rosters from the 1860s and 1870s. And through it all, they grew closer, sharing not just the excitement of their investigation, but their hopes, their dreams, the stories of their lives that had led them both to this moment. Eleanor learned that Thomas had grown up the son of a police captain, that he had studied history and law before joining the force, that his passion for cold cases came from a belief that every person deserved justice, no matter how much time had passed. Thomas learned that Eleanor had chosen teaching over marriage because she valued independence and intellectual engagement, that her love of literature came from her late father who had read to her every night, that she had always felt slightly out of step with the expectations society placed on women of her class. On a crisp November evening, exactly 2 weeks after their first meeting at Madame Bouchard's café, Thomas called upon Eleanor at her boarding house with news that made his eyes shine with triumph. The landlady, Mrs. Peterson, had been scandalized at first by the frequency of the detective's visits, but even her stern propriety had softened when she saw how respectfully he treated Eleanor, how carefully he observed every social convention even as his obvious affection became impossible to hide. Eleanor received him in the parlor, where a fire crackled in the hearth against the autumn chill. She had been grading papers from her students, but set them aside immediately when she saw his expression. "You have found something," she said, not a question, but a statement of certainty. Thomas sat beside her on the settee, closer than strict propriety demanded, but not so close as to cause true scandal, and pulled a folder from his leather case. "I have found everything. Eleanor, I know what became of Margaret Rose Sutherland." Eleanor's heart raced as Thomas opened the folder, revealing copies of documents he had obtained from various archives over the past days. I started by contacting historians who specialize in the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia, which was a major hub for the Underground Railroad and for progressive social causes during and after the war. I provided them with the timeline of Margaret's disappearance and asked if they had any records of a woman matching her description arriving in their networks in April of 1864. He pulled out the first document, a letter dated May 1864, from a Quaker Aid Society in Philadelphia to another in upstate New York. This letter mentions the arrival of a young woman from Boston, referred to only as M, who had been forced to flee threats related to her abolitionist sympathies. The letter requests assistance in finding her safe passage to a community in western New York where she could begin a new life. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the letter, reading the careful script that spoke of courage and sanctuary. Western New York. That was where many abolitionists settled, was it not? Where the Underground Railroad had strong networks? Precisely. And that led me to investigate communities in that region that were known for their progressive views and their welcoming of those who needed to disappear from their former lives. Thomas pulled out another document, this one a church registry from a small town called Seneca Falls. Look at this entry from June of 1864. A woman named Mary Sutton joined the congregation of the First Presbyterian Church. Mary Sutton, M.S. The initials match if we assume she kept her first initial and used a variation of her surname. Eleanor studied the registry entry, her excitement building. Seneca Falls. That is where the Women's Rights Convention was held in 1848, is it not? Where Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott launched the suffrage movement. Exactly. It was a community known for progressive ideals, for supporting causes related to abolition and women's rights. The perfect place for someone like Margaret Rose to build a new life doing the kind of work she and Captain Aldrich had believed in. Thomas's voice was warm with satisfaction. But Eleanor, it gets even better. I found more. He spread out several more documents, newspaper articles, church bulletins, and finally, a wedding announcement from 1867. Eleanor read it aloud, her voice catching with emotion. The congregation of First Presbyterian Church is pleased to announce the marriage of Miss Mary Sutton to Mr. Daniel Webster, a teacher and activist for educational equality. The couple will reside in Seneca Falls, where they will continue their work with the Freedmen's Bureau, helping formerly enslaved people establish new lives in freedom. She found love again, Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. After losing Jonathan Aldrich, after giving up everything she knew, she found someone who shared her values and built a life with him. Thomas nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. There is more. I found records of their work together. Between 1867 and 1890, Mary Sutton Webster and her husband Daniel established 3 schools for African American children in New York and Pennsylvania. They advocated tirelessly for educational equality and voting rights. They were instrumental in helping dozens of formerly enslaved families establish themselves in the North. Mary became a notable figure in the women's suffrage movement in New York, though she always avoided publicity and never allowed her photograph to be widely circulated, presumably to protect her identity. Eleanor looked through the documents, seeing the outline of a remarkable life lived in service to the very causes that had forced Margaret Rose into exile. She honored Jonathan's memory by continuing his work. She gave up her name, her family, her privileged life, but she never gave up the principles they both believed in. And there is one final piece, Thomas said softly, pulling out a death notice from a Seneca Falls newspaper dated March 1892. Mary Sutton Webster died peacefully at her home, surrounded by her husband and the many students and families whose lives she had touched. She was 59 years old. The notice mentions that she was a beloved teacher and activist who had dedicated her life to justice and equality, and that she had once remarked to friends that though she had known sorrow in her youth, she had also known great love and purpose, and considered herself fortunate beyond measure. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by the completeness of the story they had uncovered. Margaret Rose had not merely survived, she had thrived. She had transformed tragedy into purpose, loss into meaningful action, and had lived a life of significance under her new identity. Her mother never knew, Eleanor said quietly. Adelaide died in 1892, just months after Margaret. She spent her entire life not knowing that her daughter had found happiness and purpose. Thomas took Eleanor's hand gently. Perhaps she did know, in some way. Remember her journal entries, how she sometimes felt peaceful, certain that Margaret was doing meaningful work. Perhaps a mother's heart can sense such things, even across distance and silence. And now, because of you, because you found that necklace and cared enough to investigate, their story will not be lost to history. Margaret Rose Sutherland and Mary Sutton Webster can both be remembered and honored. Eleanor looked at Thomas, at this remarkable man who had entered her life because of an abandoned necklace and stayed because of something far more profound. What happens now? Do we publish what we have found? Tell the historical societies? Ensure that Margaret's courage is recognized? I think we should, Thomas said thoughtfully, with discretion and respect, of course. We should tell the story of a young woman who stood by her principles even when it cost her everything, who built a new life dedicated to justice and equality, who honored the memory of the man she loved by continuing the work they both believed in. It is a story that deserves to be known, especially in these times when we still struggle with many of the same injustices Margaret and Jonathan fought against. Eleanor nodded, then smiled through her tears. And the necklace? What becomes of Jonathan Aldrich's gift that Margaret never received? Thomas considered this. I think it should be donated to a museum or historical society, displayed with the full story of Margaret Rose Sutherland and Captain Jonathan Aldrich, of their courage and their sacrifice. It should be a symbol not of lost love, but of enduring principles, of the idea that some things matter more than social approval or personal comfort. That seems fitting, Eleanor agreed. A memorial to them both, and to all those who fought for justice when it was dangerous to do so. They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the parlor. Finally, Thomas turned to face Eleanor fully, taking both her hands in his. Eleanor, these past 2 weeks have been extraordinary, and not only because we solved a 30-year-old mystery. You have reminded me why I became a detective in the first place, why I believe that truth matters and that every story deserves to be told. But more than that, you have shown me what it means to find a true partner, someone who sees the world with the same eyes, who values the same things, who challenges me to be better and more thoughtful. He paused, his voice becoming uncertain in a way she had never heard before. I realize we have known each other only a short time, but I am 33 years old enough to recognize something extraordinary when I find it. Eleanor, I am falling in love with you, and I hope you might feel the same. Eleanor felt her heart swell with joy so intense it was almost painful. Thomas, I do feel the same. From the moment you walked into that cafe and treated me as an equal, as someone whose thoughts and observations mattered, I felt something shift inside me. You have given me not just this adventure, this story, but the sense that I have finally found someone who understands me completely. I am falling in love with you, too. Thomas raised her hands to his lips, kissing each one with tender reverence. Then may I court you properly? May I call upon you regularly? Take you to dinners and concerts, introduce you to my family? May I hope that in time, when you are ready, you might consider becoming not just my partner in investigation, but my partner in life? Yes, Eleanor said simply, her voice steady and sure despite the tears of happiness streaming down her face. Yes to all of it, Thomas. I want all of it with you. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her close in a way that was both thrilling and deeply comfortable, as if they had been meant to fit together exactly this way. Eleanor rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the warmth of his presence, and felt completely at peace. You know, she murmured after a moment, when I found that necklace in the bookshop, I thought I was simply curious about an interesting historical artifact. I had no idea it would lead me to Margaret Rose's story, to understanding courage and sacrifice in a way I never had before, and I certainly had no idea it would lead me to you. Thomas pressed a kiss to the top of her head, a gesture so natural and affectionate that it made her smile. Fate works in mysterious ways, perhaps. Or perhaps it was simply that two people who were meant to find each other needed the right story to bring them together. Margaret and Jonathan never got their happy ending, but perhaps by honoring their memory and telling their truth, we have earned ours. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor and Thomas prepared a comprehensive article about their discovery, working with the Massachusetts Historical Society to properly document and display the necklace, along with Adelaide's journals, and the evidence of Margaret Rose's new life as Mary Sutton Webster. The story captured public imagination when it was published, a tale of love and loss, courage, and redemption that resonated deeply in an era still grappling with the legacy of the Civil War and the ongoing struggle for equality. Thomas was indeed true to his word about courting Eleanor properly. He called upon her regularly, escorted her to lectures and concerts, introduced her to his family, who welcomed her warmly, delighted that their son had finally found someone who matched his intelligence and passion for justice. Eleanor's mother, though initially shocked by the speed of the romance, was won over by Thomas's respectful manner and obvious devotion to her daughter. Even the headmistress at Miss Pemberton's academy, while maintaining her proper reserve, could not help but approve of such an appropriate match. On a snowy evening in December, exactly 2 months after Eleanor had found the necklace that changed her life, Thomas took her back to Madame Bouchard's cafe, to the same corner table where they had first met to discuss the mystery of Margaret Rose Sutherland. The cafe was decorated for Christmas, garlands and candles creating a festive but intimate atmosphere, and through the lace-curtained windows, they could see snow falling softly on Newbury Street. "Eleanor," Thomas said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "we began here, with a mystery and a necklace, and 2 people from the past who deserve to have their story told. We have told that story now, given them the recognition they earned through their courage and sacrifice. But in doing so, we have also written the beginning of our own story, one I hope will be much longer and happier than theirs was." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket, and Eleanor's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a ring, a simple but beautiful sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, elegant and timeless. "This is not a reproduction of Margaret's necklace or an attempt to recreate the past. This is something new, something that belongs only to us and to the future we can build together. Eleanor Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you be my partner in all things, my companion in seeking truth, my love for all the years we have ahead of us?" Eleanor did not hesitate. "Yes, Thomas. Yes to everything, to all of it, to you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, and then came around the table to pull her to her feet and into his arms. When he kissed her, gentle and passionate and full of promise, Eleanor felt as if all the pieces of her life had finally fallen into their proper places. She had spent years teaching about great loves in literature, about characters who found their perfect matches and lived happily ever after, but she had never truly believed such things happened outside of books. Now, held in Thomas's embrace, she knew she had been wrong. Sometimes, if you were very fortunate, if you paid attention to the stories the past was trying to tell you, if you were brave enough to follow where a mystery led, you could find your own happy ending. The cafe's other patrons noticed the engagement and applauded softly, their approval warm and genuine. Madame Bouchard herself came out from the kitchen with a bottle of champagne, compliments of the house, to celebrate the occasion. As Eleanor and Thomas sat together, hands clasped, rings glinting in the candlelight, they toasted to their future and to the past that had brought them together. "To Margaret Rose Sutherland," Eleanor said softly, raising her glass, "may her courage never be forgotten." "And to Captain Jonathan Aldrich," Thomas added, "may their story inspire others to stand for what is right, no matter the cost." "And to us," Eleanor finished, smiling at the man who had become her everything in the space of 2 remarkable months. "May we honor their memory by building a life filled with love, justice, and purpose." They clinked their glasses together as snow continued to fall outside, as Boston settled into winter's embrace, as their story, which had begun with an abandoned necklace from 1864, moved forward into a future bright with possibility. Eleanor thought of Margaret Rose, who had sacrificed so much but had found meaning and purpose in her new life. She thought of Adelaide, who had carried her secret with such devotion. She thought of Jonathan Aldrich, who had died too young but whose love had been honored across decades. And she looked at Thomas, at his intelligent gray eyes and his gentle smile, at the strength and kindness that radiated from him, and she knew that while their investigation had begun as an attempt to solve a historical mystery, it had evolved into something far more precious. The discovery that love, real and true and lasting, was not just the province of romantic novels and bygone eras, but something that could be found in the present moment, if one was brave enough to recognize it and wise enough to hold on. 3 months later, in March of 1896, Eleanor Whitmore became Eleanor Ashford in a simple but beautiful ceremony at the church where Thomas's family had worshipped for generations. She wore her grandmother's lace veil and carried white roses, and when she walked down the aisle on her brother's arm, she saw Thomas waiting for her at the altar, his face radiant with joy and love. The necklace that had brought them together was displayed at the Massachusetts Historical Society by then, part of an exhibition about Boston during the Civil War that included Margaret Rose's story and honored the courage of those who had fought for justice and equality. Visitors came from across the region to see it, to read the inscription, "To M.R. With eternal devotion, 1864, and to learn about the young woman who had given up everything for her principles and the detective and teacher who had uncovered her truth 3 decades later. Eleanor continued teaching at Miss Pemberton's academy, though she moved to the married teacher's quarters and delighted in sharing her own story of mystery and romance with her students, encouraging them to believe that intelligence and independence could coexist with love and partnership. Thomas continued his work with the police department, solving cases both current and historical, but he always said that his greatest success would forever be finding Eleanor. They built a life together filled with books and investigations, with dinners spent discussing history and justice, with quiet evenings by the fire and adventures pursuing new mysteries. They had children eventually, 3 of them, and told them stories about their parents' courtship and about the brave woman named Margaret Rose, who had helped bring them together across the span of time. And sometimes, on snowy December evenings, Thomas would take Eleanor back to Madame Bouchard's cafe, to that same corner table where they had first met, and they would hold hands and remember the beginning of their story, grateful beyond measure for an abandoned necklace and the love it had helped them find, grateful for the courage of those who had come before them, and grateful most of all for each other and the life they had built together, a life of purpose and passion and endless enduring love.